In graduate school, I was trying to answer the question, why do the smaller shops that I had historically worked with and the large shop that I was working for at the time in Washington, I was working for a large health charity in Washington, what are the advantages and disadvantages that they have? And that underlying assumption is generally that the larger shops have the advantage of larger constituencies that are presumably more affluent. And what I started to figure out is that as you begin to know and understand these organizations and what is happening in these organizations, it really is the absence of that middle lane. It's that absence of a middle lane. And so if your organization doesn't see and understand the middle lane for whatever reason it is, you're going to get stuck in the top loop. Because if you look at these three lanes, what happens when you mistakenly try to cross multiple lanes of traffic all at one time? Right? We all know what happens when you try to rush from lane one, which is that initial gift, to these very significant gifts. And if you also understand the science of expertise, which is most of what we're going to talk about in this second session, if you know and understand the science of expertise, it really comes down to the ability to see and understand and recognize patterns of behavior. And the top lane is not going to give you a lot of pattern of behavior other than just like what I said earlier, it's just going to give you 2 or 3 data points, which is generally the size of the gift and the date of the gift. That's generally what you get. I got a question during the break on the front card, what are these B's and these R's? The balancing loops there, basically what that means is that's the explanation. The balancing loop is basically the explanation for why when you host a special event, for example, you put a little more energy into it, and that particular year you get a little bit more out of it, and then it seems like a year or two later you got to put a little bit more into it. So it keeps kind of just balancing out. It's the same reason why that's what addiction is if you think about it. So you put that, like right now my wife is, I got 4 kids and her husband's out here doing this kind of crazy stuff. And she's trying to raise these 4 kids and she really needs to get more sleep, but instead to get rid of that headache, she takes aspirin to get rid of that headache. And every time she takes aspirin, you go down a path where you need a little bit more to do the same thing. That's essentially what's happening in your top loop, is you keep putting in a little bit more in order to presumably get a little bit more out of it, but you're only getting incremental growth, not exponential growth, which is what happens when you move your donors into those subsequent lanes. I will be here all day. Fundraisers are my people, so my expectation this afternoon is you're going to corner me and you're going to want me to unpack some of this sort of stuff. I'd be delighted to do that. And like I said before we got started, I've got plenty of these cards with me. So in graduate school, I was trying to answer that question is what are the advantages that these larger shops have? And I ran into this concept of the science of expertise. And that's what we're going to spend most of our time with. I'm not going to be intense. I'm not going to throw around as many foul words. I'm not picking on any more software companies. This is actually a pretty light session. I think you'll all enjoy this. But what this session is really about is it's about the organization who does recognize the value of getting into lane 2, recognizing that it's the unpredictable, inefficient, messy middle lane that most organizations can't have because they're designed for control. This capital campaign model, which is the effective campaign, I don't like to spend a lot of time on this. Because quite simply, I like to sort of offer my critique on the way that capital campaigns are being done. I'm sort of introducing a different type of framework, and I'm also trying to empower more frontline fundraisers to know and understand how capital campaigns work, again, because I don't think you need to be paying these large consulting firms to do work that you're perfectly capable of doing. I have a client in Fort Worth, Texas right now who told me when he really got his head wrapped around this single card, he said, there is a firm that tried to charge me $112,000 basically to teach me what's on this card. If you can get your head wrapped around what's going on this card, you can create extraordinary value for yourself and your employer. And you can run really any capital campaign, any major fundraising initiative. And if you also want to know and understand how this particular side of the card works, I'm going to point out a couple of things, but we're going to spend most of our time here in this session on the back, on the KPI card. If you take your 3 lanes and you turn your campaign on its side, you see where the lanes line up. So once you get your head wrapped around how the 3 lanes work, and once you get your head you sort of get the cylinders in the campaign, you see how basically that works. Are you seeing that? So if you get the organization to be more responsive, which is to say it's more about generating activities, ongoing activities in all 3 lanes. All your organizations need the benefit of all 3 lanes at all times, and you need to be able to respond to those opportunities as they come, which is the reason I don't like capital campaigns. I don't want you to have to wait to start a capital campaign in order to take advantage of Uncle John who's ready to write you $1 million check. I want you to be ready for that. And so if you know how to sort of have 3 lanes running at all times, if you know how to relinquish control to the top lane, have your boss focusing on the top 25, which is in the bottom, and if you understand how this card here works, you can do that. 3 things I want to point out here though, and then we're going to move to the back. 3 things. Do not sign on for cash campaigns, and do not sign on for capital campaigns. And when I say don't sign on, do not sign on with an employer who thinks that he or she is going to do a capital campaign in 2 years, or that he's going to do it all on cash. That's not how capital campaigns get done. Most of people in higher education recognize what is called the 12-year spread. That 12-year spread is what's going across the bottom of this card. So what is that 12-year spread? That 2 years there is the 2 years that they spend identifying their top 5 donors who are generally going to give them 30% of their goal. But that's an exploratory process, which means you're going to take 50 people out to lunch in order to find the 5. That's part of what that exercise is. So a lot of the consulting work that I do is actually I spend time going on those meetings with those donors, helping them discern who those 5 people are. But that's the 2 years before you write your case for support. If you go sign on with a new boss and he or she has already put a case for support and a beautiful picture on the wall and says this is what we're going to do, but he can't tell you who these donors are that are going to give 30%, go work for somebody else. Right? I think that's beautiful, that $15 million project, but do you know who your early investors are going to be? No, we don't know. We're going to start talking to them later. They're not going to buy anything. And you guys don't need to be signing on for those employers who have a naive understanding of how capital campaigns work. So those are those 2 years. Write the case for support after you find that 30%. That's the 5 years that most capital campaigns actually you see. That's the 5 years you see, right? That's the 5 years that goes in the case for support and the timeline and everything. And then this 5 years is the reason why financing is so important, is because there's a gift that comes in on the last day of the campaign. It's a 5-year pledge, and it requires a financing structure so that your campaign doesn't lose its momentum and its enthusiasm. This is why you're hearing large institutions talk about basically being in a nonstop campaign mode. They're always running campaigns because they basically know that campaigns in a traditional sense, in a linear, predictable world, you think they happen in 5 years. No, they happen in 12. The other thing that this card points out is that capital campaigns generally do not lag at the front end or the back end where we like to spend all of our time. Your first 5 donors who are generally giving you 30% of the goal are generally the people who you know. They've written those types of checks before. They've written those types of checks to your organization. They generally have written checks to other organizations, and they're very accustomed to doing this. Right? You know who these people are. Generally, these are the people who get freely talked about in board meetings. You talk about them in your development offices. It's Mr. Smith, it's Mrs. Johnson. Those are your lucky 5 or 6 that are going to drive the front end of the campaign. The back end of the campaign is basically Giving Tuesday playing out in a capital campaign. Okay? The middle of a campaign is the same middle that we were talking about with the messy middle, and it's where you all get to show up and really do the hard work of what it is to be a rock star fundraiser, but it's going to require you to take donors and move them who are currently giving in one lane and move them to the next. But that's the messy middle of a capital campaign. If anybody thinks that a capital campaign is driven by volunteers, you're crazy. You're crazy. The most sophisticated, most successful capital campaigns are driven by talented fundraising professionals. That's where we're going, people. The largest capital, I just talked to a guy in Kentucky recently, large institution. He said, I need to hire 40 major gifts officers. If you go to LA, you go to Los Angeles, this was in the Chronicle Philanthropy a couple of years ago. It sort of blew my mind. USC and UCLA combined, between the two of them, have 750 fundraising professionals. If you're raising money in LA and you're not working with those two institutions, you don't really know how fundraising really works. It's a large machine, and what it is it's a lot of people navigating the middle, not the stuff that gets seen on the front and the back end. And where you all get to show up for your bosses and create real value and do what Cal Newport calls deep work is in the middle. Are you guys getting my point? Am I driving the message home? Good. Okay. The only other thing I like to point out about this is the difference between asset-based and income-based donors. Anybody who's taken an economics course, or if you remember your economics courses, let's just remember our economics courses when we start planning for capital campaigns. There is a line in between our lives. It's called it's basically it's generally about 55 years old, where we sort of move from the asset side of life to the income side of life. There's the income side of life where we're basically, every decision we make is sort of afforded to us based on our income. And then there's the second half of life where most of our decisions have to do with the assets that we've accumulated during our income side of life. Generally, that line is recognized in economics at about 50 to 55 years old. That's also where you need to sort of know and understand very practically how your capital campaigns are going to play out. So what does that mean? When you're doing a feasibility study, if you so insist to do a feasibility study, if the average age of the individuals that you're participating in your feasibility study is not upwards of 55 years old, you're interviewing the wrong people because they're not on the asset side of life. They're not on the asset side of life, and you need to be okay with that. Yes, there are people in Austin, Texas who've made, in Silicon Valley, who are 42 years old and sold their companies to, Microsoft and all of that stuff. If you've got one of those sort of long shot, sort of outlying sort of donors, that's fine, I get it. But generally speaking, your major mega donors in a capital campaign are going to be upwards of 55 years old. They're not going to be 42-year-old moms and dads at your private school. I work with a lot of private schools, and I'm like, okay, why are you packing in these galas and these golf tournaments with 42-year-old dads who, yes, they look wealthy because they can pay your tuition. They're not paying for your new building. They're not at the time of life to do that. And so what am I saying here to all of you? I'm just saying, look at this card, get your head wrapped around it, and know that when you sign on, because yes, we are turning over every 18 months. You all are hopping from job to job. But if you get sharper and smarter, you can actually go work for organizations and know better than to sign on for jobs where you're being set up to fail. Does that make sense? Okay. Catch me afterwards. If there's any part of this particular card, I'll be happy to explain it to you. Okay, so this side of the card, for most of you, if you have, any of you who are familiar with, many of you are familiar with the job descriptions of a major gifts officer. So you heard me say before the break that I think that the job description of most fundraising professionals who are operating in the middle lane are going to look like major gifts officers more than they're going to look like those who are running special events and running direct mail campaigns in 5 or 10 years. But you also heard me say that most organizations are driven by a desire for control, not a desire to grow. One of the key messages in my book, if you choose to read it, is that there's an inverse relationship between growth and control. And all of you, in most cases, are being set up to work for organizations that are driven by control, not a desire to grow. But let's also be very mindful of the fact that fundraising is a function of growth, not to grow. They do want you to raise more money, right? That is what you're getting paid to do, right? Okay, that's going to mess with their sense of control. And if you tell them we're going to have to start taking people out to lunch, you're going to start asking questions like, oh my, how do we pay for that? So what do we have to do? We have to design a sense of control, which is this card, for those people who are accustomed to the outer 2 lanes. So we have to teach your boss how to be your boss. That's what we have to do. So I actually use this card to coach and train development officers, but you know what I'm really doing? And usually the boss doesn't get this. I'm really teaching him or her how to be a really good boss. The first thing I'm doing with this particular card is I'm focusing on inputs, not outputs. Stop signing on for job descriptions that say outputs. Outputs means dollars. You have no control over how much money you actually raise. That's an output. From a very systems understanding, you cannot control how much your donors actually give. You can control how often you meet with them, who you're meeting with, and how you're meeting with them. But to suggest that you can actually take the pen out of their hand, write the check for them, tell them to sign that check is completely bogus. So stop signing on for job descriptions that say you can actually control how much your donors give. And I'm going to say that with my interview with the Chronicle Philanthropy tomorrow too, and it might get me in trouble. But I think too many of us are signing on for job descriptions based on outputs that are not within our control. So everything on this card is actually a variable that you actually control. Who you're meeting with, like are you meeting with Mr. Smith or Mrs. Johnson? Because sometimes you don't need to meet with Mr. Smith or Mrs. Johnson because they have no desire whatsoever to write you a check, right? So stop meeting with them. Or you have names on your list that are not going anywhere. It doesn't matter how many times you call them, so get them off your list. The other thing is we can pay attention to how you meet with them. We can pay attention to how you meet with them. I want top-notch development officers who know how to do 12 to 15 meetings a month at a minimum. And if you're not determined to do that in the middle lane, you're not going to get recruited and you're not going to get hired in some of the shops that I'm describing 5 and 10 years out. You're not. So you're either going to get stuck in the top lane and constantly complain about the fact that you're not getting paid enough, or you're going to need to get in a different line of work. But once you get into then that sounds harsh, but once you get into the middle lane and you actually start to experience the type of work that I've experienced and many of you probably already have, you find out that the middle lane, the messiness of the middle lane is really not all that scary. It's just you've not been in that middle lane. And so you're scared of something that you've never really experienced in a meaningful way. You're rationalizing the idea that somebody's got to pick up the tab. They will pick up the tab and they will write you a check. They will. Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question. You said 12 to 15 meetings a month.
A month.
Is that with new people or is that some of the same people you're meeting?
Yeah, so I'm working with a client in Philadelphia right now, so we'll identify a completely unexperienced individual, put them in that role, and I will expect them within 90 days to be averaging 12 to 15 meetings a month. They will start with what I call an assigned list, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But they will start with an assigned list of current donors. Basically, the large shops and the small shops all have the same problem. But one of the problems that we have is that we're not handing lists to individuals like yourselves and saying, take people out to lunch that are current donors. We're handing you lists based on what Wealth Engine said, right? And at best, they gave you $125 in Giving Tuesday. You have no idea whether these people are even interested in a meaningful relationship with you. And so you all are agreeing to this and then taking the heat when it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I want to assign you a list. We're going to get into that in a minute. Anyway, so what I figured out in grad school is there's basically 3 metrics that large, mature fundraising operations are looking at, and there is research to back this up. But basically what your organizations need to be looking at and what your organizations need the benefit of and what is a mature middle lane, to answer that question, is basically 150, maybe 120 to 150 names that are basically have moved from relatively cold to willing to have a meaningful conversation with you to a multi-year pledge. That's really all that the green to the yellow to the blue is. And so I want your boss to know how to sit down with you every quarter or every month and say, okay, you've got 150 names on your list. How many of them have moved from won't even talk to us to willing to sit down and have lunch or a cup of coffee to how many of them have moved to a multi-year pledge? There's a woman at Auburn, had the pleasure of meeting with her about 6 months ago. She did her PhD looking at mature fundraising operations in hospitals, and she figured out that the most mature fundraising operations, 40% of the revenue is coming from multi-year pledges. And so I want you all in this room, as I'm advocating for you all, you are my people, I want you to know how to navigate multi-year pledges. You're not even there, it doesn't sound like you're even soliciting them, right? Right, in your job. So I want you to have the benefit of knowing how to sit down with a donor, raise the expectation from Giving Tuesday, right? And then eventually know how to ask for a multi-year pledge. That's how we can set you up for success long term. So these patterns of work in the middle here, are basically me looking at your 12 to 15 meetings a month. I want you to have a fair balance between knowing how to do an initial meeting. An initial meeting is that first meeting you have with a donor, mixed with that subsequent meeting, knowing how to hang out with a donor, take them to a ball game. If I'm your boss and I see that your 12 to 15 meetings a month is averaging heavy on the initial meeting side, what does that tell me? What's that?
You don't know how to do an initial meeting.
If it's heavy on the initial side?
You're doing too many.
You're doing too many, right. And if it's heavy on the subsequent side, what does that suggest to you?
You're not asking.
You're not going for him.
Right. What you want your boss to know how to do is know how to start looking at these sort of variables, these patterns of work, and know how to discern how you're going about your work. And so if I want him to look at that him or her, I want them to look at that first thing. The second thing I want them to look at is how many of your meetings are done with or without an ask. If all of your meetings are being done with asks, what does that mean? What's that?
Not doing the full release.
Right, you're not going, right. If all of your meetings are heavy on the ask side, yeah. And if you're not asking, what sort of conclusions can she draw? You're hesitating, right, yeah. I want to teach him or her, your boss, how to coach you and look at these different variables that are actually within your control and that are raising your level of expertise in order to be valuable in the marketplace. The last thing is I want you to know how to move between the patterns of single gifts to multi-year pledges. Those of you who have routinely solicited those types of gifts, how many of you have noticed that oftentimes a donor in their upgrading process will move to an increased gift and then a multi-year pledge and then an increased gift? Have you seen that? Yep, okay. See, those nods on your head suggest to me expertise that those who didn't nod would suggest that they don't have. That's pattern recognition. That's the science of expertise, is your ability to see that pattern sort of play out in the lives of your donors. But if all I'm looking at is your gifts on Giving Tuesday, I'm not seeing that now, am I? Nope, I'm not seeing that. Okay, so I can explain that more during maybe after lunch or whatever if anybody's interested, but I want to teach your boss how to look at what are variables that are within your control and let him or her know that this is what I'm paying you for. I'm not paying you to guarantee that we're going to raise $1 million this year. I'm paying you to take a list of names and warm up that list, right? And I'm paying you to do a particular types of pattern or work. Now, will your work, for instance, in this middle column here, lean towards one way or another? At times it will. That's perfectly fine. There's really no right or wrong in that middle column there. That's just me knowing how to sort of look at your work, look at your patterns, and discern what you're doing. Most of your bosses don't know how to do that, so all he or she does is they look at the bottom line and they say, you didn't bring any money this month, so you must not be very good at your job. Am I right? How many of you had that experience? This is what I get really excited about, and this is the concept of deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is the idea of being a golfer or an artist or being a musician and saying that there are micro skills, there are smaller skills within the context of getting really good at your job that you can focus on that sort of raise your performance level and sort of push you outside of your comfort zone in order to increase your ability to perform. And these particular deliberate practices, this is not a doctrine here, this is not the guaranteed best list of 5, but these are the 5 that I have found to be most helpful for training up young development officers who want to get really good at this type of work. The first thing is that they have an assigned list. What does that mean? It is a list. It's the 150 names that a lot of you, if you're major gifts officers, have, but I put that word assigned in front of it very deliberately, which is to say I do not want any of you having meetings with anyone that is just an arbitrary decision on your part. I want those names essentially assigned to you, which means your board and your boss or your committee or somebody needs to take the time to sit down with you and say, okay, if you're going to take that young man or that young woman or that older gentleman or whoever that donor happens to be, and you're going to buy them lunch at Panera, and on the chance that you have to pick up the tab, you better make sure that somebody else is accountable for the fact that that's who you're meeting with. And a lot of you are agreeing to work for bosses who are lazy and just say, go in that database, there's thousands of names in there, run a report, and just go start taking people out to lunch. And then when that doesn't work, they want to blame you for not doing your job. That's what the assigned list is designed to do. And so when I sit down with a board, so if you all were on a board and we were doing a 2-day retreat, that would be one of the first things I would say. Like, for instance, my client in Philadelphia right now, before the development officer actually starts his or her job, we will make sure that they have 150 names to hand that individual as an assigned list and say, start taking those people out to lunch. And then we will review that list every 90 days. If those relationships are not going anywhere for more than 6 months or 2 quarters, the names come off the list. That means those donors are not interested. And that's okay, they're interested in something else. I don't care what Wealth Engine says. See, that's the problem, Alex, that you run into, is that those names are sitting on that list because they think that they're multi-million-dollar donors. Those donors are never going to go out to lunch with you, right? That's part of the problem in there. The next thing is 2 weeks out. 2 weeks out is a way for me to test whether or not your donors actually give a damn before they actually start writing you a check. And it's to discipline yourselves to be able to manage a schedule of 12 to 15 meetings a month. And so 2 weeks out means that when you pick up the phone and you say, hi, Mrs. Johnson, can I take you out to lunch? Thank you for that gift that you gave last week on Giving Tuesday. You never schedule your meetings any sooner than 2 weeks out. There's a couple of reasons you do that. The first reason you do that is because it allows you to manage more meetings on your schedule. It allows you to get more handle on your schedule. A lot of your organizations are absolutely putting out fires all the time, and you're never going to get into the middle lane in any meaningful way if you're always sort of just working off of, what can I do tomorrow sort of patterns and habits. The second thing is I want the donor to signal back to you that you're actually a priority in their time before you ask them to be, and before you ask to be a priority in terms of their money. Oftentimes you'll pick up the phone and Mrs. Johnson will say, sure, come by the office tomorrow. What she's doing there is she's basically doing nothing more than her go-away gift that she's going to give you when you meet with her, is she's saying, you're not a priority for me, come on by, I'll meet your expectations, and I'll forget everything we talked about when you leave. And so what you're doing is you're incorporating patterns and habits into the way that you relate to your donors to ensure that you're a priority for your donors before you start asking them for more meaningful levels of support. That's what 2 weeks out does. The next thing is that meaningful conversations. Now, I think most of you were in that first session, and I went through that outline. That outline is also in my book. But that's the idea that every one of these initial meetings need to begin with those 5 questions, which means every time you meet with a donor, you're not sitting there opening up the case for support and showing them everything and talking and running their mouth, kind of like you guys are all allowing me to do. But you're actually allowing them to feed you and inform you and allow you to know and understand why it is they care about the mission. If they're current donors and you ask them those 5 questions, you'll learn everything you need to know about why it is the organization's important to them. You don't need to convince them of much at all. Those of you who are skeptical of that, largely is just because you haven't gotten out in the field and encountered that. But no one who's going to who is a current donor, who is routinely giving to you and is going to agree to sit down with you for 45 minutes to an hour, knowing you're going to ask 5 questions like that, Most of my clients actually put those 5 questions in front of their donors in a letter ahead of time, and so they get their donors to ask those, to sort of simmer on those questions before the. You would be surprised how fast you can fast track those relationships if you'll just sort of set them up really well in that first meeting. The fourth thing is what I call subs and teams. Subs and teams. Next time you sign up for a job, say to your boss, how many of my meetings, my 12 to 15 meetings that I do every month, how many of my meetings are you actually going to go with me on? A lot of you have signed on for jobs where they expect you to go on meetings, they expect you to ask for money, they expect all of these amazing things. They want you to just have money just raining from the sea, from the sky, and they don't know what the hell you're doing because they're never out in the field with you. And if you're highly achievement-driven individuals, you want constructive feedback, but they don't actually see what you're doing in order to actually give you feedback on what you're doing. So not only do you not have a method like this to evaluate your performance, but he or she, your boss, is not seeing what you're doing. And so what I like to say to supervisors is I don't want supervisors managing their own portfolios. I don't care if you're a fundraiser or not, but I want all of your fundraisers who are working for you to know that 50% of their meetings, you're going to accompany them with them. I was working with a client in Memphis, Tennessee, and the head of school said to me, this is a retired naval captain, he said to me, I went on 2 meetings back to back with my director of development and it totally wore me out. And I was like, that is an extraordinary observation. I want your bosses, your boards and your bosses, it doesn't always have to be the boss. That's the other thing too, it doesn't always have to be the boss, but if your organization will commit to the idea that 50% of your meetings, or all what I call subsequent meetings, the subs, that's what subs means, subsequent meetings are done in teams, they will know and understand what you're doing. But if you will not incorporate that discipline, and then you come back to the organization or you come into a seminar like this and you say, we don't have a culture of philanthropy, we don't have a culture of fundraising. You're not going to create a culture of fundraising or a culture of philanthropy, whatever you want to call it. You're not going to have that if they don't know and understand what it is you're doing. So if you don't create a system, a structure, an expectation that says you go on these calls with me, it does not always have to be the boss. It does not have to be the board chair. It can be department heads. It can be whoever you want. It can be people in the program. But if you're doing these things alone, you're setting yourself up not to enjoy your work, not to get appropriate feedback. You're actually creating a very shallow experience for the donors. Right? Yep. See, that nod right there is experience. That nod right there is an indication that she's taken somebody either on a meeting or she's experienced the shallow experience of a donor just saying, oh my gosh, do I have to meet with a fundraiser yet again? Right? The last thing is I think your boards and your bosses are going to get more and more rigid in terms of wanting to pay you to do things like put your asks in person and then you want to put them on paper. That's actually how you close the loop on my assigned list. So if you agree to that assigned list, which is to say you've got that spreadsheet has 150 names, we assign that to you on day 1, there's a point somewhere down the journey, right, where those names are going to either come off the list or you're going to have solicited them. And I want your board or your boss to see that solicitation actually happening. They don't even actually have to be on that call with you. But if you actually ask for that money in person and then re-articulate that solicitation in proposal form, written form, 3 paragraphs on letterhead, and copy your boss on it, now you've closed that feedback loop and he or she knows what you're doing. Folks, this is what your organizations are paying you for. Now, you could come up with a different set of metrics, but you notice these are all inputs, all within your control, and this is what I think the fundraising world is going to pay for 10 years out, and it's certainly what I'm advocating for. But you also notice there's not a dollar on this card. But your boss will learn how to be your boss. I've got a client over in Lancaster who's been using this now for 2 years with a development officer, and he's like this, and he's a minister and an educator, and he's stumbled through having, he didn't know how to supervise development officers. He didn't know what a development officer looked like. What this has allowed him to do is actually see the value of what it is you're actually doing. So, what about this card is hard to own? The whole idea behind this card is that it's focused on variables within your control, and it also allows you as an organization to start getting into the middle lane. This is a job description for the middle lane. So if you say to me, somebody came to me, one of you came, several of you probably came to me during the break and said, we're stuck in lane 1. Well, one of the ways to get out of lane 1 is to give them a framework where they feel control in lane 2. This is one of the ways to do that. And then if they see this metrics, if you can get your board bought into this, which is to say that the board chair starts asking about these variables, then the CEO is now accountable for this, your boss. I guarantee you it'll transform your understanding of how your work gets done. And you won't be losing your job simply because the numbers don't match up that particular week because he or she is nervous. He doesn't think the budget's going to get made. Because it's an unpredictable type of work. The middle lane is unpredictable. You need to be responsive. You need to be in the field. You need to be in sort of a constant churn mode. If Giving Tuesday is doing its job, and I'm telling you that on the assigned list, that list should be refreshed every 3 to 6 months, right? You see what Giving Tuesday is doing? It's creating the additional opportunities to go on to that list. You guys putting all that together? All right, so just like I did in the earlier session, what on this card or even on the other card is hard for you to own? Yes, sir.
What's your opinion on, you know, someone on your list has the ability to make an impactful gift,
Yeah.
but they're not responsive.
Yeah.
Do you let that person go?
I think that's the ownership of lane 1, 2, and 3. I think a lot of your name, sir? Jim. So I think a lot of organizations know who those donors are, and they're betting on them for like their big initiatives, like their capital campaigns and stuff. Right now, what you're describing is a donor who's essentially sitting in lane 1, right? He or she is probably giving in. Are they active in some way? Yes, okay. Your organization has to have a commitment first to a meaningful level of support and a meaningful relationship before you maximize that opportunity, which is where I think the well screening and stuff gets in the way. I think that well screening information has essentially gotten in the way of you guys knowing how to, because I think you know how to build a meaningful relationship with that fella, is my guess. If you wanted to build a relationship with me, you would know how to do that. We're all human beings. We know how to build relationships. What has happened is that money opportunity has sort of clouded it. You need to get in lane 2 with that guy. Is he a Rotarian? It's the messiness figuring out. It's just figuring that out. There's no answer. That's the thing about the middle lane, is there's no hard and fast rule to it. But your culture is so accustomed to control, predictability, efficiency. When the hell is he going to write that check? He gave us $125 in Giving Tuesday. Now he owes us $1 million. It doesn't work that way. And you know that. You know that. But you're also working for an organization that doesn't. And that's kind of a tangent to answer your question. But that's what you guys are signing up to do, is you're working for organizations that have no value of the middle lane. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm hoping you can give a little bit more explanation around the temperature. So,
Yeah.
Is it they're moving from cold to warm when they bump up on their membership level?
Yeah.
Or is it when they volunteer?
Yeah.
If you can,
Yeah, so this gets back to, remind me your name? Kristen. So Kristen, this gets back to my research that I was doing in graduate school, and I was asking myself, what is the sophistication that's really happening in these larger operations? And this gets back to the value of the data. So those metrics there in a large, mature fundraising operation, there are all sorts of variables that are indicating whether or not you're warming up your list. And all of those are relevant. It's just moves management happening. But what I'm doing is I'm taking your organization that's generally a small shop with a boss that doesn't know what he or she is doing, and I'm saying, let's boil this down to some really basic metrics so that you can every month see progress. And what I'm getting at is I want a list that's generally cold to start with. And the first indicator is, will they sit down and have that meaningful conversation with you? That's warm. And you're probably going to sit there for a while. That's actually a current donor. That's a current donor. And then periodically, you're going to have that same donor and 149 others. Periodically, you're going to have donors moving to that multi-year pledge. And so as long as your boss is seeing that movement, right? I don't want your boss concerned about pretty much anything else. That's progress. But right now, your boss isn't seeing anything other than just looking at the bottom line, so he or she doesn't know how to measure anything. But the idea that they'll sit down and have a meeting with you that first time, have that meaningful conversation is enough for me, right? And then knowing that 2 or 3 a month might move into that red zone, which means you've warmed up a list. It's going to take 3 years. It's going to take 3 years to do, and that's what we all know. Any major gifts officer knows that he or she is going to take about 3 years to warm up a list. But we're trying to create a culture that knows and understands that. Yes, ma'am.
What about, a large part of my goal is to deal with unrestricted gifts.
Yep.
And this is proving really challenging.
Yep.
When I think about multi-year pledges to unrestricted, I find myself being just studying myself to how to make that case in the best possible way that's going to reach somebody.
Yeah. So I'm talking to a university in Philadelphia right now, and the middle lane, I'm a believer in design thinking. Design thinking is the idea that we are makers, creators, and designers. And so I'm talking about a sort of an idealized world. But I want you to have the benefit of a middle lane that has 80% of your revenue. 80% of your revenue that's charitably driven should be coming from that middle lane, unrestricted. And what your organizations are doing is and if you all know who Charity Water is, right? We all know who Charity Water is. Charity Water didn't come up with anything brilliant. All he's done, and he's selling this stuff to the moon and back. He thinks he's reinvented charity. What he's done is he's created essentially what he needs to be unrestricted. What unrestricted means in your organization is what basically it's the fixed cost that I have to pay for overhead, fixed cost, unrestricted. It's all basically, I need to be able to have money that I need so I can do what I need to do that's not designated as a variable cost to programs. Charity Water has a separate account, and they've sold that thing like crazy. All he's selling is a middle lane. So what I want you to say to your boss is I want you to say, we're going to begin to create an organization that has the benefit of a middle lane that we're generating 80% of our charitable revenue from fewer than 150 donors in an unrestricted way. And I don't want you to talk about a capital campaign until you get there. Because you think that because you're sitting there, okay, think about if you don't see the middle lane, because that is the definition of a thriving middle lane. 80% of the revenue that your organization needs to raise coming from, and by the way, I'm sure there's organizations that are out there doing it, but I'm sure that's like a dream out there. I'm sure that's a utopian thing, okay? But if you think about the way that most of your organizations are designed, they're trying to create all this unrestricted support from lane one, from uncommitted donors at the highest marginal cost, right? You see all the mess that's happening, and the only alternative you see is to do a well screen on all those same people and think that you're going to get unrestricted gifts from people that are going to give you $1 million. There's got to be something in the middle. Right?
Right. I keep saying capacity is not inclination.
Yeah, right.
Just because you have $1 million doesn't mean you're going to give it to me.
Right.
You take time, but there's a budget goal that's raining down on me that
Your organization doesn't see the middle lane. Your organization doesn't see the messy middle that happens. There's a great book out there. Go look at any business section. The guy at it's this thick. And it's the idea, you look at the way that movies are done. Nobody likes the messy middle of relationships. It's not the part that's fun. It doesn't get all the attention. But it's the hard work that we all are signing up for, and what we've done is we've created cultures that either are stunting our growth in lane 1 or prematurely trying to move into lane 3, and you guys are all taking the hit for it. And that's what you're basically saying to me without me, right? Am I discerning that correctly? Yes, yes. Any more questions? Yes.
Fishing in here. But so the assigned list is kind of an interesting point that they brought a lot of folks have run into now, and they say, well, just go dig into the database, you'll find people some good well screening information. How would you suggest that a supervisor, whether it be a VP development, whether it be a board member, whether it be an executive director, how would you suggest they go about building that assigned list and having that ready to go for day one for a development officer?
And this is what I'll do with my Philadelphia client. So this is a Philadelphia school, private school, that really is just trying to build their program up from the ground up. And I will say to them, let's develop an assignment with no database. They're like so far, they're years away from where a lot of you are. But I want an assigned list that's relatively warm. So for instance, the first names on that list are probably, in a private school setting, are probably board members, parents. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a culture that just knows how to employ somebody who's routinely leaving the office and spending his or her time away from their desk and not being paid to plan events. Because part of what you all are doing is you have created a culture that is so entrenched in lane 1, entrenched in that top loop, and it's largely reflected in the way that you do your work. So the organization totally flips out when they don't see you sitting there at your desk. Right? You've created a culture that does that. And so back to your question, I want to give that what is that first iteration of the assigned list look like? I just want to get the best list as quickly as I can of people that I know will take the meeting, even on the chance that they're the wrong names. I'm not terribly concerned about whether or not they're the right names or the wrong names, because I want to create that pattern of organizational behavior. Are you following me here? Your bosses don't know how to see you leaving the building. But you can't raise the types of money and you can't move beyond Giving Tuesday without leaving the building. And so you've just got to get out the door. But the deeper side of what you're talking about is your boss needs to sit down and take 2 hours every quarter to review that list with you, or he doesn't give a damn how successful you are. And you need to set that expectation that says, you know what, if you can't sit down with me once a quarter and review this list and decide that, you know what, this relationship's not going anywhere, and therefore we need to find somebody else so that when I call them, I can actually get a response. That's him or her suggesting that, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with fundraising, or I don't want to have anything to do with being out in the field with you. Look, I know bosses that will do that for you. I'm not saying that's your boss, but what I'm saying is you guys are all signing on, and those of you who've been around long enough and who've worked in the smaller shops know what it's like to sign on with an organization that has basically hired you to be the awkward stepchild, to sort of be pushed off in the corner, right? Right? That's what you're being paid to do. You can't create a culture where you're going to be hyper successful with an organization that doesn't want to have anything to do with you. And so you create deliberate practices. So Alex, you can't do this on your own. And this kind of gets to your question too. You all have to recognize that we're talking about organizational change. We're not talking about getting really talented people here. We're not talking about fundraising consultant. We're talking about organizational design. And so when I do a training session like this, it's a 2-day training session. This is my little pitch here. Most of the time when I do a training session, it's 2 days, it's these 4 cards, and I'm creating all this tension with your boards, your bosses, your leadership team, and yourselves. That's what I do. It's very deliberate, it's messy, but we're talking about organizational design, because we're going to actually confront the fact that your boss doesn't want to have anything to do with fundraising, and we're going to let this process, this messy process here, we're going to let the uncomfortable things that I might say actually surface that. But then we're also going to completely acknowledge the fact that that's okay. There's probably nothing wrong with your boss wanting to have nothing to do with fundraising, so let's design a system and a machine that doesn't undermine your ability to be a rock star and his or her ability to maybe... The thing is what happens With the boss who doesn't want to have anything to do with fundraising, because they don't want to have anything to do with it, they end up diminishing and sort of pushing you off into a corner when in fact the best thing they can do is elevate and sort of move you front and center in order to take that lead. That's called shared leadership. That's saying, I'm not really good at this, but I also don't know how to supervise you and set that expectation. That's classic shared leadership at its best. So let's elevate you, set the expectation correctly, allow you to lead in this area, and I'll follow you along and allow you to shine at times. That's the type of organization most of you need to work for. A lot of you are not. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
This might be a silly question, but my supervisor has always told me, don't let the donor pay.
Right, right. What's your, I'd have to get to know your boss a little better. Is that does she have an MSW or something? What's her background? I mean, if she has, is it a she? It's a she. Does she have any sales background?
Marketing, but mostly fundraising, actually. She's no longer the advancements VP. She's now the administrative VP. She's moved to a different role, but she's still my supervisor. What do you say?
Yeah, listen, I've had plenty of instances.
I mean, for lunch.
Right, paying for lunch, yeah. Organizations that are thriving in the middle lane ultimately arrive at places where they have more unrestricted support. So I'm sort of bringing all these questions together. When you get to that place, and most major gifts officers are raising that support. So you look at larger institutions, they've got armies doing that. So they're routinely taking people out to lunch. They are periodically picking up the tab. It's really not an issue. So I was picking on your question. You want unrestricted support. You've got to have that commitment to doing that. You get that. To your question, I want the subsequent meeting. I want the follow-up meeting. So any of us who've been coached in fundraising know that you're always asking for something at the end of the meeting. It's a very adaptive sort of space. If you're routinely there, you know how to even use the humor of who's going to pay the check, right? I mean, how many times have we been at those meetings where we've said, okay, you pick up the check this time, but you're sure as hell letting me pick it up next time, right? I mean, whatever it is that sort of gets you to the next table. And if you look at that card, I want you on average to be soliciting no more than 25 to 35% of the time. So you're doing 3 meetings before you ask for anything. So if he picked up the tab on the first meeting or the second meeting, you still got to pick up the tab on the third. So I think that's more of an adaptive sort of knowing what's going on. There's nothing wrong with letting him pick up the tab. Or you picking up the tab, because that's what you're saying. You're saying that if I was sitting in front of your boss and we were doing that, what I do with boards and bosses, I would unpack that in a let's understand what's going on there sort of way. Because there's something else in there at a psychological sort of implicit motives. There's something going on there that says to your boss, is my guess, that explains why she has to always pick up the tab. I don't know what it is. Psychologists understand that stuff. I'd want to figure out what that is.
Every time you pick up the tab, that's just more money that can't go to your cause. So.
Well, if your boss, generally people who are CEOs have power and control motives, and they generally see the world in a zero-sum game. So somebody who's in a zero-sum game is saying that in order for me to lose is for you to gain. And so there's probably something going on there where she doesn't want the donor to lose or gain, or I don't know. I want to create that tension in order for you to figure it out so that doesn't create a messy problem for you. But we are not creating organizations that know how to sit in that messiness, because the outer lane and the innermost lane are very predictable, very controlled, and very much setting you all up for failure. Any other questions? I have one more. Okay.
So a lot of my donors are not local.
Yeah.
I can't take them to lunch.
Yeah.
It's all going to be on the phone.
Yeah. Yeah. The two ways I answer that is learn how to buy the plane ticket is no different than learning how to pay for your cell phone bill and learning how to, it's the same thing. The middle lane has its expenses, but the other thing is I think too many organizations have developed constituencies in places that they don't need constituencies. And that's a condition of that outer lane, which is to say that you've got these donors. Volume is what's going to create these large constituencies that happen to be all over the place. The other day I had the same question asked of me. She says, I've got this wealthy donor, I don't know them, I can't get a meeting with them, and they're in Wyoming. And I'm like, why do you need donors in Wyoming? Can't you, I mean, but let those other organizations that are there have donors there. Are you, what type of organization are you?
Well, we are called the International Institute for Restorative Practices, and we do work all over the country and all over the world.
Well, then you have to have donors all over the world, and consequently, you have to have a budget to get to those donors. That's what I would say to your boss. If you want to be an international organization, you're trying to market. I mean, organizations like to put that word international in front of their name, and they like to do it for all sorts of reasons. Well, if you can't own up to the fact that you're going to have donors in international places, which therefore means you're going to have to buy plane tickets, right? Yeah, I don't know what's right or wrong. I would love to banter it out. That's what I like to do. Yeah. All right, was this fun?